You know the image, you've seen it 100 times. Johnny Cash and June Carter, side by side on stage, singing into each other like the rest of the world didn't exist. The man in black and the woman who saved him. America's greatest love story set to music. The outlaw who burned everything down and the angel who pulled him out of the fire. Hollywood made a movie about it. Joaquin Phoenix won awards for it. Reese Witherspoon took home the Oscar. The whole world watched that story and believed it because it was beautiful. And because beautiful stories are easy to sell. But the real version isn't beautiful. It's devastating. The man America called an outlaw never spent a single day in prison. The woman they called his savior didn't cure his addiction. He was still swallowing pills the night of the concert that made him a legend. And the first wife, the one the movie turned into a footnote, waited until both of them were dead to publish a memoir that tears the fairy tale apart from the inside. The woman everyone forgot looked June Carter in the eye and heard her say 5 words. He will be mine. And the worst part? Nobody could answer her. Because by the time that book came out, Johnny and June were both in the ground, 4 months apart. 4 months. The strongest man in country music survived decades of amphetamines, a body that was failing him for 15 years, and a darkness that started with a dead brother and a table saw in Arkansas. He survived all of it. And then June died. And 4 months later, his lungs filled, his heart gave out, and the man in black followed her into the silence. The doctors called it diabetes. Everyone who knew him called it something else. This is the story no movie had the courage to tell. And the truth hits harder than any myth ever could. America decided the song was the marriage, the tall woman and the man in black, singing into each other's eyes, proof that love conquers everything. It didn't. What happened between Johnny Cash and June Carter was something rarer and more painful than a love story. It was 2 broken people holding each other together with bare hands, and the moment one of them let go, the other collapsed in under 4 months. Remember the name Vivian Liberto. In 40 years, it becomes the crack that runs through the entire foundation of this story and the corrective that Hollywood tried to bury. J.R. Cash was born February 26, 1932, in Kingsland, Arkansas. Not John, not Johnny, J.R., just the initials, because his mother wanted to name him John and his father wanted Ray, and neither one would give. So they gave him letters instead of a name. Think about that. The man who'd become the most recognizable voice in American music started life as a compromise nobody was happy with. The family moved to Dyess, Arkansas in 1935, a New Deal resettlement colony carved out of swampland in Mississippi County. The government gave each family 20 acres, a 5-room house, and enough farming supplies to either survive or go under trying. Ray Cash and Carrie Rivers. Cash were Southern Baptist cotton farmers with 7 children. Johnny was the 4th. The floors were rough. The work was constant. And the hymns on the radio were the only thing that made the evenings bearable. Valerie June Carter came into the world on June 23, 1929, in Maces Spring, Virginia, at the foot of Clinch Mountain. And she was born into something Johnny Cash couldn't have imagined: musical royalty. Her mother was Maybelle Carter, Mother Maybelle, 1/3 of the original Carter family, the group that essentially invented recorded country music. June grew up assuming everybody's mother played guitar on the radio. She didn't know anything different. By the time she was 10, she was performing on stage with the Family Act. But there's a distance between those 2 childhoods that matters. June had a 9-room house, paid for by her father's ex-railway salary and the Carter family's record income. Johnny had a shack and a cotton field. She grew up knowing she was somebody. He grew up knowing he was nobody, and both of those beliefs shaped every single decision they made for the rest of their lives. On May 12, 1944, Johnny's older brother Jack walked into the agriculture shop at school to cut oak fence posts on a table saw. He was 14. Something went wrong. The saw caught him and nearly cut him in half. Jack lived for about a week. He died on May 20th. Johnny never recovered. He carried that death like a stone in his chest for 60 years. In his autobiography, he said he'd had a premonition that morning, a feeling that something terrible was coming. His mother felt it too. Whether that's memory sharpened by grief or something stranger, nobody alive can say for certain. But what's documented is the aftermath. Johnny's father blamed him, not directly, not in words you could point to, but in the silence, in the distance, in the way Ray Cash looked at the son who lived and thought about the one who didn't. Years later, Johnny told a journalist something chilling. He said he believed Jack was murdered, that a neighbor had removed the safety guard from that saw and disappeared afterward. He couldn't prove it. Nobody could. But he believed it until the day he died. That wound, the dead brother, the father's silence, the guilt of surviving, became the engine underneath everything. The darkness in his voice, the obsession with prisoners and outcasts, the pills, the fire, the crawl into a cave to die. Every act of self-destruction Johnny Cash ever committed traces back to a 14-year-old boy and a table saw in Dyess, Arkansas. And the only thing that ever made the noise stop, even for a moment, was music. He enlisted in the Air Force, and that's when J.R. became John, because the military wouldn't accept initials as a first name. He learned guitar in Germany, he listened to the radio obsessively, and when he came home, he walked into Sun Records in Memphis with two men behind him, Luther Perkins on guitar and Marshall Grant on bass, and played for Sam Phillips. His first single, Cry, 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 came out in 1955. It hit number 14 on the country chart. Then came Folsom Prison Blues, top 5. Then I Walk the Line, number 1 country for 6 weeks, crossing over to the pop top 20. By the time he moved to Columbia Records in '58, Johnny Cash wasn't a regional act anymore. He was a force. And it all happened fast. Too fast. Because success doesn't heal wounds. It just gives you the money to make them worse. July 7th, 1956. Backstage at the Ryman Auditorium, the night of Johnny's Grand Ole Opry debut, he met June Carter for the first time. She later said she couldn't remember a single thing they talked about, except his eyes. He reportedly told her right there that he was going to marry her someday. She laughed. He was already married. He had a wife named Vivian and a baby daughter named Roseanne at home. June had just gone through her own divorce from country singer Carl Smith. Neither of them was in a position to promise anything to anyone. But watch what happened next. Because the thing about Johnny Cash and June Carter is that the love story and the catastrophe started on exactly the same night. They just took 12 years to collide. By the early 60s, Cash was everywhere. Ring of Fire, written by June Carter herself with Merle Kilgore, hit number 1 on the country chart in 1963 and stayed there for 7 weeks. It crossed to number 17 on the Hot 100. Their duet Jackson won the Grammy for Best Country and Western Performance in '68. The music was unstoppable. But here's the part most people skip. Both of them had serious acting careers, not vanity cameos, real work. Johnny starred in 5 Minutes to Live in '61, a grindhouse thriller where he played a psychotic criminal. He went toe-to-toe with Kirk Douglas in a gunfight in '71. He played a gospel singer who murders his wife in one of the best episodes of Columbo ever made, Swan Song, 1974, opposite Peter Falk. And then there was the Johnny Cash Show on ABC, a 2-season variety show taped at the Ryman. The premiere featured Bob Dylan and Joni Mitchell. Later guests included Louis Armstrong, Ray Charles, and Neil Young. 58 episodes. It got canceled in '71, not because of ratings, but because the network was purging rural programming. June's career was just as serious, and in some ways more impressive. The director Ella Kazan saw her at the Opry and told her to study acting. She didn't take a workshop. She went to New York and trained with Lee Strasberg and Sanford Meisner at the Neighborhood Playhouse, the same school that produced Robert Duvall and Steve McQueen. She appeared in Gunsmoke. She acted alongside Duvall himself in The Apostle in '97. She and Johnny both appeared in Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman, June as Sister Ruth, Johnny as a character called Kid Cole. These weren't hobby projects. These were two artists operating at a level that the country couple label never captured. Subscribe now, because the man who stood on that stage accepting Grammys and starring opposite Kirk Douglas was simultaneously destroying himself at a speed that should have killed him a dozen times over. And the woman standing next to him knew it before anyone else did. Here's something everybody thinks they know. Johnny Cash was a convict. He did time. He sang from inside because he'd been inside. He didn't. Not once. Not ever. Johnny Cash never served a single day of a prison sentence. The whole legend rests on one night. October 4th, 1965. El Paso International Airport. Customs agents found 688 Dexedrine capsules and 475 Equinol tablets hidden in his guitar case, smuggled back from Juarez. He spent one night in a cell. He posted bond. 2 months later, a federal judge gave him a $1,000 fine and a 30-day suspended sentence because the pills were technically prescription drugs. That's it. One night, one fine. The rest is mythology. He also got picked up in Starkville, Mississippi, that same year for picking flowers in someone's yard. A few drunk and disorderly arrests. Nothing more. So why does the entire world believe Johnny Cash was a hardened convict? Because of Folsom. Because he walked into Folsom State Prison in January '68 and San Quentin in '69 and performed for men in cages with the same authority as a man who'd been in one, and nobody in that room questioned it. The performance was so convincing that it became the biography, and Johnny never corrected anyone. Why would he? The myth was better for business. But the truth matters more, because he didn't need prison to understand suffering. He had something worse. He had himself. The pills started somewhere between 57 and 59. Accounts differ, but the pattern doesn't. Amphetamines to get through 300 shows a year. Barbiturates to come down. Alcohol to fill the gaps. He roomed with Waylon Jennings for a while, and between the two of them, the hotel rooms looked like pharmacies. He was wrecking everything. His marriage to Vivian was collapsing under the weight of addiction, infidelity, and absence. 4 daughters, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, Tara, growing up watching their father disappear. Vivian filed for divorce in '66, and then the fire, June 27, 1965. A fire from Johnny's camper burned 508 acres of Los Padres National Forest in California. It killed or drove off 49 of the refuge's 53 endangered California condors. When the government sued him and he was deposed, he said, "And this is the court record, I don't give a damn about your yellow buzzards. Why should I care?" Final judgment, $82,000 plus interest. That's not an outlaw being romantic. That's a man so far gone on pills that he incinerated a national forest and couldn't feel a thing about it. June watched all of this. She and the Carter family staged interventions. They flushed pills. They sat with him through withdrawals. And according to the version everyone knows, she saved him. Single-handedly. Love conquered addiction. The end. Except it didn't end. He relapsed. Again. And again. He was still using at the Folsom concert in January '68, the concert that defined his comeback. He went to the Betty Ford Center in '83, 15 years after the supposed salvation. The idea that June fixed him with love alone isn't history. It's a greeting card. What she actually did was harder and less cinematic. She stayed. She didn't fix him. She endured him. And there's a difference between those two things that the movie never had the courage to show. February 22nd, 1968, London Gardens Arena, London, Ontario. 7,000 people in the seats. Johnny and June have just finished singing Jackson. The last note fades, and Johnny doesn't walk off stage. He stands there. He looks at her, and in front of 7,000 strangers, he asks her to marry him. She told him to shut up. She was terrified. The crowd was screaming. He told her he wouldn't sing another note until she answered. She said yes. They were married 7 days later, March 1st, in Franklin, Kentucky. Their son, John Carter Cash, was born 2 years after that. And for a while, a real while, it looked like the story had earned its happy ending. But remember Vivian Liberto? Here's where that name pays off. In 2007, 4 years after both Johnny and June were dead and couldn't respond, Vivian published a memoir called I Walked the Line. And in it, she told a version of events that demolishes the fairy tale. She wrote that June didn't rescue Johnny from addiction. She wrote that June pursued him relentlessly while he was still married, and that June once looked Vivian in the eye and said, "He will be mine." She alleged June enabled his drug use rather than curing it. She described a woman who wasn't a savior, but a competitor, and a husband who didn't fall in love so much as transfer his dependency from one fix to another. Now, this is Vivian's account, published when nobody named in it could answer. Reviewers noted the book reads as a direct rebuttal to Walk the Line, the film that turned Vivian into a footnote and June into a saint. Her daughters later made a documentary, My Darling Vivian, 2020, that filled in what the Hollywood version erased. Was Vivian bitter? Probably. Was she also telling the truth about things the legend had paved over? The evidence says yes to that too. The answer isn't one or the other. The answer is that this was never a love triangle with a villain. It was 3 people wrecked by the same man's addiction, and history only had room for 2 of them. And then there's Nickajack Cave. In his autobiography, Johnny described crawling into the cave in October '67 with the intention of DIing. He said he went deep enough that he couldn't find his way out, lay down in the dark, and waited. And then, he wrote, he felt God's presence. A spiritual awakening. He crawled back out and began the journey towards sobriety. It's one of the most powerful stories in rock and roll memoir. It's also contested. The Tennessee Valley Authority closed the Nickajack Dam gates on December 15, '67, flooding that cave permanently. Construction on the dam had been restricting access for months before that. Whether Cash could have physically entered the cave in October '67 is an open question. And the timeline has another problem. He was still using pills at the Folsom Prison concert in January '68, weeks after the supposed awakening. So did it happen? Maybe in a different cave, or at a different time, or as a compressed version of something real spread across months. What's certain is that Johnny Cash did hit a bottom so deep he wanted to die. Whether the geography matches is less important than the fact that the desperation was real, but an honest telling has to say, the cave story is his version, and the calendar doesn't fully support it. The decades after the wedding were not the gentle sunset the legend implies. Johnny relapsed, multiple times. The Betty Ford stay in '83, a double bypass heart surgery in '88, a misdiagnosis of Shy-Drager syndrome in '97 that turned out to be autonomic neuropathy, nerve damage that slowly dismantled the systems his body needed to function, diabetes, recurring pneumonia. The man in black was being eaten alive from the inside. And then Rick Rubin called. The American Recordings era, starting in '94, didn't just revive his career. It reinvented what a career in music could be. The first album won a Grammy for Best Contemporary Folk Album. Unchained, the second, with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers backing him, won Best Country Album. And then American 4. The Man Comes Around in 2002, the one with the cover of a Nine Inch Nails song that turned a young industrial rock track into the most devastating goodbye in music history. That recording went platinum. It won him a Grammy for Best Short-Form Music Video and the CMA Single and Video of the Year. 13 Grammys total, including a Lifetime Achievement Award, the Country Music Hall of Fame, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame, the Gospel Music Hall of Fame. Johnny Cash is one of the only human beings to stand in all four. But by 2003, the trophies meant nothing, because June was dying. May 7th, 2003, June Carter Cash went into surgery for a heart valve replacement. She was 73. She never fully recovered. On May 15th, at 5:04 in the afternoon, Central Time, at Baptist Hospital in Nashville, surrounded by her family and Johnny, June Carter Cash died of complications from the surgery. Johnny was at her bedside. He'd been at her bedside for 8 days. And this is the part where the documented record says more than any interpretation could. After June died, Johnny didn't stop working. He went back to the Cash Cabin studio in Hendersonville and kept recording, track after track after track. Dozens of songs in his final months. People around him said he believed it was what June would have wanted. On July 5th, 2003, less than 2 months after her death, he played what would be his last public performance in Hilton's, Virginia. Before one of their signature songs, he said this to the crowd: "The spirit of June Carter overshadows me tonight. With the love she had for me and the love I have for her, we connect somewhere between here and heaven." He was dead 69 days later. September 12th, 2003, Baptist Hospital, Nashville. The official cause was complications from diabetes, resulting in respiratory failure. But here's the truth. The death certificate doesn't capture. 4 months. That's all it took. The strongest man in country music, a man who survived decades of amphetamines, a national forest fire, a spiritual crisis in a cave that may or may not exist, and a body that had been failing for 15 years, that man held on through all of it. And then June died, and 4 months later, so did he. The doctors called it diabetes. Everyone who knew them called it something else. And here's where the thesis comes home. America wanted a love story where the angel saves the outlaw. What actually happened is that two deeply damaged people made a deal with each other. I will hold you up if you hold me up, and they kept that deal for 35 years. It wasn't clean, it wasn't simple. Vivian Liberto paid the price for it. June Carter endured things no movie ever showed. And Johnny Cash spent his entire life trying to outrun a dead brother, a silent father, and a darkness that no amount of fame or faith or harmony could fully cure. But the deal held, until one of them couldn't hold on anymore, and then the other one had no reason to. So play that song again, the one you've heard 1,000 times, the one about a ring of fire, a song she wrote, not him. Listen to what's underneath it now. Two people who needed each other so badly that the needing was indistinguishable from the love. Two people who stayed when staying cost everything. Was it the greatest love story in American music? Or was it something darker, something closer to mutual survival? John Carter Cash still runs the Cash Cabin studio in Hendersonville. He's produced every posthumous album, including Songwriter in 2024, his father's 72nd studio record, built from demos Johnny recorded in 1993. Rosanne Cash is still performing. Vivian's daughters made sure her story was finally heard. And in March 2025, 56 years after she first sang harmony with the Man in Black, June Carter Cash was announced as an inductee into the Country Music Hall of Fame. She didn't live to see it. Neither did he. But the hall is a building, and buildings hold things that people can't. June died in May. Johnny died in September. And 5 weeks after Johnny, June's daughter Rosie Nix Adams was found dead of carbon monoxide poisoning. 3 deaths in 5 months. One family. No explanation that fits on a headstone. He got the legend. She got the Hall of Fame, 22 years late. And somewhere between Baptist Hospital and the Cash Cabin, in the silence between the last note and the flat line, the harmony finally stopped. It's the one thing that never came back.